Hi, welcome to session one of the fourth topic of the semester titled The Texas Revolution. So this is the Texas Revolution of 1836, and we're going to examine this topic rather thoroughly in three separate sessions, just like the previous topics. So we're going to proceed, with the same format that we have been following, three sessions per topic or so. So let us proceed then to cover this fourth topic. I remind you, this is the fourth topic of the semester. We're moving forward into the second historical period, the second portion of the semester that is going to look at the Texas Revolution, Texas in the midst of the Civil War, and of course, the process of Reconstruction as well. Three separate topics, by the way. So again, this is a new section, a new round of topics that is going to deal now with a new historical period. Once again, the Texas Revolution, Texas in the Civil War, and Reconstruction. So let us proceed then to look at the opening segments of this topic of the Texas Revolution. Let me share the slide here. So this is the title, once again, the Texas Revolution, 1836. And I'm presenting here to you the table of contents of the main parts that we're going to cover about the Texas Revolution. So it consists of, three main parts. The first part, which we're going to actually examine today, is going to look at the Texas Revolution, but in a larger context, the Texas Revolution in the age of revolutions, that is to say, because the Texas Revolution of 1836 was not really an isolated event taking place here in the state. Again, this is going to be a process of independence from Mexico now again. So there's going to be a revolution against Mexico to gain the independence of Texas. But this was not an isolated event, as we'll see, but rather it was part of a larger historical process. The Texas Revolution was part of a larger process in which there was a series of revolutions that have been taking place, particularly in the Western world, Western Europe and North America particularly, that the Texas Revolution was part of, that is to say. So instead of just delving immediately into the revolution itself, we're just going to examine today, again, how Texas was part of this larger age of revolutions. It was part of that. So we're going to cover that in this session, and then in a separate session, we're going to look at the origins and the causes of the Texas Revolution itself. So it is in session two that we're going to delve now deeper again into the actual factors that led the population of Texas, the Tejanos, and the other groups that live here as well, to come together and declare independence from Mexico. So the second session, or the second part, is going to just look exclusively at the causes and the origins in great depth. And the third session is going to look at the War of Independence, okay? The Texas War for Independence itself. So the spark of the war, for example, we're going to look at the mobilization of forces, the Declaration of Independence, Santa Anna, the dictator of Mexico, moving into Texas, and of course there's going to be a struggle. We're going to look and assess very closely at that process in the very last session. Okay, so let us then proceed with our first part, which is Texas in the age of revolutions. Okay, so this is extremely important because otherwise the Texas Revolution is not going to be very well understood because some of the ideas that people were fighting for, even the goals of the revolution itself, what people wanted to accomplish, that is to say, the peoples of Texas, what they really wanted to accomplish with the revolution, are not going to be understood because if we don't really go back in time and say, okay, so those ideas, that the Texans were actually fighting for, the kind of political institutions that they wanted to create, and so on and so forth, the political principles that they announced that they were fighting for, etc. All of those, again, began to emerge as early as the 1600s in Europe, and they flourished, of course, in certain areas of Europe, and they produced revolutions, by the way. They produced revolutions in Europe that produced political change, the birth of new political institutions, new forms of government, and so on, that we're going to actually look at here. And eventually, again, they ended up spreading into the Americas in places like the 13 British colonies of North America, of course, the American Revolution itself, and the creation of the United States was part of this larger process in which, again, there was a series of ideas that were formulated in Europe that began to change the way people organize politically. What kind of state, what kind of government will be the ideal to govern human societies. And of course, that produced what is called the Age of Revolutions, the formulations of those ideas and people fighting for those ideas, announcing those principles, and again, engaging in struggles again against the political order that governed those societies in Europe. And of course, that's going to produce what is called, again, the Age of Revolutions. So we have to understand this process, again, that Texas was part of. The Texas Revolution was a continuation of this process in which people were simply trying to establish the ideal state. That is to say, there were new ideas in the air. There were new forms of thinking about politics, doing politics, and so on, that people really wanted to bring about. They really wanted to live in those kinds of political structures. And again, so that ended up, again, in revolutions, again, because there's going to be a struggle between the forces that govern human societies during those times and, of course, the forces that wanted to bring political change. And that produced what is called, again, the revolutions of the Western world. Okay, the Texas Revolution was just, again, a part of that. It was a continuation of this process. Now, I mentioned just a second ago that those political upheavals, those political revolutions, that began to arise as early as the 1600s in Europe, particularly England. We're actually going to pay attention to that, rather quickly here. Those struggles, whether it started in England and spreading into places like France or in the 13 British colonies of North America and so on, those struggles were struggles to implement, to bring about certain political changes, reforms, to bring about new institutions, new forms of government, that is to say. And so most of those revolutions actually were challenging what is called the old feudal order. Okay, without exception, all of those revolutions in one degree or another, whether we're going to be looking at the English Civil War or the French Revolution, the American Revolution, those revolutions, again, were really struggling. They were challenging the old feudal order that had been governing human societies for many, many centuries. In Europe, and of course, the British colonies were tied again to the European political systems again. So what is this old feudal order that those revolutions were fighting against? Was a kind of a complex of different types of institutions that govern human societies, sometimes hand in hand. And those feudal institutions, that I'm referring to here is the monarchy, of course, the institution of the monarchy or kingship. Again, kings, for example, have been governing Europe for thousands of years, by the way. So this institution was challenged in the Age of Revolutions that began in the 1600s, and it was actually challenged in the 1700s and in the 1800s. Of course, it's going to be significantly challenged again by popular revolts and uprisings. So monarchy will be one of those all feudal institutions. The other one is aristocracy. And the aristocracy, of course, is the nobility, the landowners, that is to say, and also the church. In this case, we're talking about the Catholic Church of Europe was also challenged in many of those upheavals in terms of trying to separate the church from the state, not necessarily abolish the church or do away with that, but rather separate the church from the state so they will be functioning in separate realms, again, of society, to separate the church from, carrying out functions of the state as well, like collecting tribute and so on. So, again, those are the old institutions, the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church that have governed European society for many, many centuries, the monarchy for thousands of years, the aristocracy likewise, and of course the church have been governing Europe since the 4th century AD. And again, starting in the 1600s, the church will be now significantly challenged, as well as the aristocracy and the monarchy, by a series of upheavals that are going to sweep across Europe, starting in England and spreading places like France and, of course, North America, of course, the British colonies of North America. So we're just going to look at specific revolutions here, not all of them, but again, the ones that actually carried more weight, the ones that really created the kind of changes that introduced new forms of government that the peoples of Texas during the Texas Revolution, the Tejanos and so on, that they really wanted to implement. They wanted to emulate, to bring about some of the ideas, the accomplishments of the revolutions of the past, particularly the ones that are going to have the greatest influence here in the Texas Revolution, are the English Civil War, the French Revolution, and the American Revolution, by the way. Okay, so what exactly then was the issue, or that the revolutions were actually challenging in any of those particular upheavals? When they challenged the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church, the revolutions that we're going to examine here, what exactly were they're challenging? And again, when we look at the monarchy, what those popular uprisings were challenging about the monarchy is the concept of absolutism. Absolutism was the idea, the notion in Europe that the kings were the supreme authority, again, of the land, and that all power was actually vested in the monarch. That is to say, it was the absolute, in other words, absolute ruler. And again, there's, of course, certain kingdoms, certain monarchies in Europe that rule under that principle. It's called absolutism, in which the monarchs claim that their right to rule was given to them by God. It's called divine rights of kings. Okay, so absolutism was actually based on this notion of divine rights of kings. That's the power, again, of the monarch was given to them by God because the monarch was part of a royal dynasty, a royal family going back many, many generations into the past, in which in a certain moment in time, when the royal dynasty was created, it was a moment in which God or the divine spirit, etc., gave the monarch that authority, of course, to that family to actually rule the kingdom. That is to say, so the monarch simply inherited those rights from the family that have been given that right, okay, by the divine. So again, that's why again there were absolute rulers, there were absolute kings, because they were the mediators between God and the people. They were simply carrying out the will of God. In other words, that every law, every action, every dictate was something that actually came from God, and they were just simply carrying out the will of God. In other words, that was the principle, by the way, of divine rights of kings. So this is again a concept that is going to be challenged, in the age of revolutions. That as we'll see, during those revolutions, people began to question, of course, that notion, that claim, and they wanted the king to share power, with certain sectors of the population. Certain sectors of the population began to flourish and acquire more prominence, and they wanted the king to take them into account. And particularly those groups are beginning to change or challenge that notion of divine rights of kings, and trying to get the kings to provide some form of representation to them. So we're going to see, of course, in depth how that process came about, the challenging of the monarchies and so on and so forth. Who did it? For what purposes and so on. Again, so we got also the aristocracy. Again, this is part of the old feudal order. Again, the nobility, the landowners. Again, and what was the problem again of the aristocracy in Europe that many people believed needed to be addressed, and they actually challenged through those upheavals. And the problem is, again, that we're going to see a group of people, the aristocracy in Europe, that actually inherited, a series of rights and privileges from their family, because they were born in specific families. They were simply born inside of families that had certain rights and certain privileges that they had acquired many centuries ago, and they were simply passing on to their descendants those rights and privileges again. And what exactly were those rights and privileges? Particularly land, the ownership of land. Not that they actually owned the land. They were simply the lords of the land. They were actually the overseers of the land on behalf of the king. So they had a land grant, in other words, issued by the king to them, that they had a right to, and of course the right to collect tribute from the populations that lived in their land. So they collected tribute. If there were peasants living in your land, you're simply collecting, of course, their products, they harvest every year, labor. People have to labor in your own house, for example, the house of the nobleman, etc., of the nobility. There's going to be servants there, people laboring there, growing foodstuffs for them, and so on and so forth. So that's another thing that is going to be questioned and challenged in the age of revolutions that we're going to look at. And also, of course, the church, the Catholic Church until the 1500s enjoyed a monopoly, a religious monopoly, in which it had no competition whatsoever. There were no alternatives to the Catholic Church. Ever since the inception of the Catholic Church in the 4th century, Europe was simply governed by the Church, and the Church also had certain rights and privileges that it enjoyed for many, many centuries, such as owning land. It was a great landowner in Europe, and also tribute collector, because likewise, if there were peoples living in the land that the church owned, therefore the peasants, the people that actually occupy those lands, had to pay tribute to the church as well. There were tribute collectors as well. So that's another issue that people are going to challenge, of course, this institution, and they wanted to separate the church from the state, so the church will not be involved in political matters of any kind, like collecting tribute, for example, from the population, or exerting a religious monopoly on the population in terms of imposing a specific faith on the people, that is to say. So people wanted freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and not follow the official religion, the official church. That's another thing, again. That will be part of the age of revolutions. So at any rate, now let us then delve into the revolutions that changed the old feudal order and introduced new political principles. Okay, we're going to analyze them one by one here. So the political principles we're going to be looking at in the next revolutions here in this segment, I just listed the most important ones. Although if you desire to do a more in-depth study again of those revolutions, you're going to find, of course, there's a series of ideas that were also important again in each one of those revolutions. But this is just a synthesis, a kind of grand summary again of the most important principles that they were fighting for, and that is the principle of private property. That individuals can indeed own property like land or resources, etc. And that is an individual right. That is to say that cannot be taken away, by a monarch or by the church, etc., or by the aristocracy. That individuals, just common people, again, can actually own property, political representation, that people can be represented in the state and have a say in the political process. They can take a vote on matters of, let's say, of taxes, whenever new taxes will be enacted, and so on and so forth. Again, political representation, popular sovereignty, the idea that the people have the right to create their own political structures, their own political institutions, form their own system of government. In other words, that's what popular sovereignty is. That people can actually get together in a community and just form, the kind of government that they want, in other words, that they seem fit or that they all agree with. Again, it's called popular sovereignty. The idea that, people have that right, again, to create, of course, political institutions. Natural rights, the idea that human beings are born with certain rights, that by nature, again, we have certain rights. We're going to look at that, of course, rather closely. Something that today is simply called human rights, by the way. Back then it was called natural rights. And also the idea of separating church and state. This is another new political principle that will come out, again, of those upheavals we're going to be looking at. The need to separate the church and the state in order to bring about the ideal form of government. To allow people to have freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, to really pursue their own religious needs, the religious experiences, and so on. At any rate, so let's look at them one by one. We're going to start with, of course, the rise of capitalism in England. Capitalism really can be considered as a kind of economic revolution. It was really a revolution, but it was more economic, in nature. But the rise of capitalism is going to be instrumental for bringing about many of the changes, many of the political changes we're going to be looking at in this segment. It was like the precursor, if you will, for all of the revolutions, if you will, the rise of capitalism. Because what capitalism actually introduced that is going to be fundamental, again, in many of the changes that will occur in Europe and in North America and elsewhere, is the idea of private property. Again, so this is a revolutionary idea, a revolutionary concept, the idea of private property, that individuals can actually, by right, own property. This was virtually non-existent, I will say, anywhere in the world up until the 16 and 1700s. Okay, the idea that individuals can actually own property because most of the land, most of the resources were actually in Europe. Particularly, if we just pay attention to Europe, were actually owned by the institutions I just mentioned. It was owned by the monarchy, particularly all of the land, again, of the kingdom was the monarch's property. Okay, it's absolute. Remember, it's an absolute ruler. Um, and of course, the monarch handed out, of course, land grants to a series of landowners, the nobility or the aristocracy, and they were the landlords. They were the lords of the land that they oversaw, and they collected tribute. By the way, and also the church was also landowner. They were, it was holding certain tracts of land for the church. For religious purposes, but also it was, creating, systems of tribute, extracting tribute from the populations as well. So the concept of private property just didn't exist, but is going to arise in the 1600s, particularly in England. This is where, again, we're going to see the rise of capitalism. This is the very first region of the world where we're going to see the beginning stages of what today we simply call capitalism. Again, it's really in England. And so how and why, that's the question. Capitalism flourished in Europe, particularly in this case in Europe, bringing about this idea of private property. That is the central pillar of capitalism. Again, that is what really distinguishes capitalism from any other system. Since the very beginning, again, it introduced the notion that people can actually own property, not just the church or the aristocracy or the monarchy. And so to answer the question, we have to look at, of course, the rise of the merchant class. That this idea of private property was a concept that was first introduced by a group of people in England particularly, but it's also something that is existing or is also experienced in other regions of Europe. And that is that this group of people are the merchant class. Okay, the rise of the merchant class. The merchants were the ones that formulated the concept, and that they first introduced the concept again of private property. This is something that occurred within the context of international trade. Okay, we examined rather briefly, by the way, in a previous topic. In one of the first topics we covered, that there was, of course, the process of international trade taking place between the 13 and 1600s. Of course, this is the beginning stages of international trade. By the way, Europeans actually stepping out of Europe and moving into different regions of the world to embark on commercial exchange. Commercial products are being now produced and exchanged across vast distances from Europe to the Middle East to the Far East, etc. So we cover that, which included, with the discovery of America, of course, products that were generated in the Americas as well. So we're going to see, in this case, with the rise of international trade, the greater and greater participation of the merchant class in international trade. Okay, because this is going to be one of the central economic activities in Europe that generate wealth. Okay, trade. So that draw a lot of people into this activity in Europe. Okay, there's going to be a lot of people that wanted to succeed in this new economic system of international trade, and they're going to do everything they can to participate in it in terms of engaging in trading operations and ventures, expeditions, investment, for example, investing also some of their monies, etc., they have saved, and so on, gold or silver in operations as well, trying to sell products or maybe create companies, what is was actually known in England as joint stock companies. Again, company of merchants coming together to share risks, to share profits, to pretty much blend investments, and again, work as a group. Okay, operate as a group. Again, many of them went into shipping. Again, there was a great opportunity, commercial opportunity for transportation services. So you own a ship, maybe a couple of ships, and again, those people that actually own the ship are going to use their ships for cargo, for carrying cargo and charging. You know, kings, they're going to be charging other merchants to carry cargo and so on. So again, shipping. In England, particularly, we're going to see commercial agriculture. People are now trying to use the land to grow crops, to feed people in the cities, in the ports. They're trying to turn the land into an enterprise instead of just having the land sitting there, okay, and just collecting tribute from the peasants. There were certain landlords that said, well, now we live in a market economy, an economy geared towards the market. There's a demand for products. Well, what is the demand now? Food. Okay, there's more people living in the ports, for example. There's international trade taking place. Well, I want to produce also products for those populations. So we're going to see the transformation of certain lands in Europe in which people are now trying to grow foodstuffs for the market and make, of course, an enterprise out of it. And of course, also using the land to graze sheep, because there was this process again of weaving wool, the wool of the sheep, into clothing. So there's also demand for clothing items, again, for people to sell clothing. And there were, of course, small manufacturers that were weaving the wool. And there was a demand for, again, the production of wool. So people were actually using the land to graze sheep as well. So again, those are great, great changes taking place in England. Again, we see the rise of a merchant class, as a result of international trade. And also, we're going to see the rise of international trading companies, not just joint stock companies within England that they were trying to import goods and commercialize with those goods inside of England, but also move abroad and trying to establish trading outposts in different areas of the world. We're going to see the rise in England starting in the year 1600. The rise of international trading companies that obtain legal permits from their kings to operate in different areas of the world, like the British East India Company, for example, created in the year 1600 to go to the Far East in search for spices. Those, again, this is an English company, but it's an international company again. That is going to play an important role, of course, in the spice trade, in also the colonization of India. We're going to see in England as well the creation of a handful of companies that will be given a charter to operate in North America, okay, and actually establish a series of colonies in North America, the London and Plymouth companies to establish Virginia, and Plymouth Company, Massachusetts Bay Company again. This is, of course, part of U.S. history. We're not going to get into that. But what's important is, again, that the economy of England by the 1600s is changing. And it's changing dramatically as a result of international trade. Okay? There's the rise of the merchant class. And there's more merchants, again, engaging in operations like trading operations, investment, joint stock companies, commercial agriculture, the production of wool, for example, and of course, investment in creating international trading companies as well. So what's astonishing is that some of those merchants were even obtaining charters of rights from the kings of England, particularly the international merchants that were moving into places like India, or they were moving to Virginia and North America or New England. They were given a charter of rights to pretty much run the colonies according to their own dictates, and it's called self-rule. Of course, there were certain conditions that those companies needed to trade with the mother country. Those were not companies that were operating on their own freely, but rather they had to serve the mother country. But the colonies themselves, were to actually form, politically speaking, by those merchants, by the colonists, and kind of develop their own systems of government. Again, self-rule, that is to say. And most of the 13 British colonies of North America were formed under that principle, again, in which the political structures of those colonies, like the towns had, assemblies, local assemblies, town assemblies, city councils, in which the local population, the colonists, were actually elected, and they were the ones, crafting legislation for the colonies, self-rule. That is to say, they had to trade with England, that's for sure, but politically, they're pretty much kind of independent, if you will. Now, of course, in England, we're also going to have, of course, another group of people that is on the rise, that is also trying to create certain changes in this direction towards private property. Okay. And that is the independent farmers that in the 1600s were known as the diggers or the levelers. I'm sorry, diggers and the levelers, as they were called. So they saw, of course, the merchants very successful in creating their enterprises, turning the land into enterprises and so on for wool production or for agricultural products and the like, where they're joint stock companies, etc. And so there's, again, a growing group of farmers that really wanted to bring about certain changes in England in order to bring about what is called land reform, to reform the system of land tenure in a way that it will give people ownership and entitlement to their land. So farmers can actually be in total control of their farmlands, that is to say. So there's yet another group of people that are not necessarily merchants, they're actually farmers, that really wanted, again, the system of private property. In principle, they're not really articulating it necessarily as private property, but what they're actually thinking is that that would be neat, that, again, farmers will have also certain rights, the rights to own their own farmlands as well. And they wanted the farmers to be in total control of their lands and be managing the lands according to how they see fit, and so on and so forth. A more democratic control, that is to say. So again, we see, of course, two groups of people, again, in England, creating what is called the rise of capitalism, because both the merchants and the independent farmers are introducing new concepts, that is to say, the concept of private property, in that their operations, their economic activities, their companies, for example, their land, that they're actually working to produce wealth. Okay, they're actually working, they're very disciplined, of course, they're working very hard, very disciplined to actually generate wealth from them. They want those particular lands, those particular companies or assets to be theirs, to be private property. Even the farmers want their farmlands to be private possessions, private property as well. So this is one of the reasons why capitalism is flourishing in England. It's because a result of international trade. And of course, there's so many different economic enterprises that over time the merchant class is going to say, well, it will be convenient, of course, to have total ownership of our property, total ownership of our lands, total ownership of our companies and our assets, the ships that I use to carry cargo, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's look at another revolution that is also going to alter, of course, the fate of Europe, particularly England, and this is also going to lead to some of the democratic principles that we have been mentioning. So this is the second revolution, is the Protestant religious revolution. Okay, capitalism was a stepping stone for the kind of changes that we're going to be looking at here. For all of the democratic revolutions that we're going to be looking at, because it introduced the concept of private property. Okay, we just cover that quite thoroughly. But also the Protestant religious revolution, okay, which was again called the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was actually a religious revolution, okay, in its own right, because in the 1500s, what the Protestants were doing is that they were challenging the Catholic Church and the monopoly the Church exerted on the doctrine of Christianity. And it had total control of the doctrine and also total control of the rituals as well. In other words, if you were to perform any ceremony or ritual, you have to perform that ritual or ceremony within the Catholic Church to be valid and to be legal as well, because to perform ceremonies outside of the church were considered part of, again, what's called heresy. You know, that those were actually people practicing magic, people practicing sorcery or witchcraft, etc. Now, that was not Christian, that is to say. So for many centuries, since the 4th century, the Catholic Church had enjoyed a total monopoly of the Christian religion, of the doctrine, the principles, the teachings of Christianity, and also of the rituals. But when the Protestants came along, again, with Martin Luther in 1517, the German monk, to challenge, of course, some of the understandings, the interpretations of the church, and leaving the church in protest, leaving the Catholic Church in mass. Again, we're going to see that Europeans, beginning in Central Europe, Germans particularly, and then later on French and English, so on, they're going to do is actually just abandon the Catholic Church in mass and trying to reform Christianity. They're protesting against the church, and particularly they're going to create a religious revolution to end the religious monopoly, again, of the church. That's why it's considered a revolution itself. They wanted to remove the Catholic doctrine and rituals and reform them. They wanted to end the monopoly of the church in terms of the church being the official church of God. The Protestants, of course, think that individuals had the right to create their own churches, of course, and we're going to see the rise of many Protestant churches, many Protestant denominations inside of Europe in the 15 and 1600s. They're trying to reject and even remove the church hierarchy, that is to say, of the Catholic Church. There was a very rigid hierarchy of religious officials and administrators, from the priests to the bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and so on and so forth. They wanted to do away with that as well for many reasons. One of them is because they were the ones, of course, trying to impose the doctrine again on the population. They wanted to impose Catholicism, in other words, on the land, persecute those that did not follow the Catholic rituals or Catholic teachings, or that questioned the Catholic teachings. And they were the ones, of course, collecting tribute. Okay, they were the ones, of course, going into different areas where people lived in their lands and trying to extract tribute from the populations that lived inside of their own church landholdings. That is to say, so they wanted to do away with that as well. So this is, again, very important, because Protestants are going to insist that they want to remove, of course, the church from the state, from the functions of the state. They're being tribute collectors, for example. So this is a kind of political revolution in a sense, even though it's religious revolution, it's also political, because they want to separate the church from politics. That is to say, the Protestants and also the Protestant churches all over Europe What they want is to have democratic control of their own Protestant churches, that is to say. So this is very important. What the Protestants are, what they seek, what they aim for, is to create their own church in which the people, the congregation, is going to actually choose the minister, choose the pastor from one amongst themselves, the best able, the most prepared, etc., that will undergo certain studies or trainings and so on. And that person will be just simply, again, selected to lead the congregation as the minister in a kind of democratic way. So instead of having an organization in which the pastor or the minister is sent to your church and is imposed upon the people. That's the way, again, the church in Europe actually functioned, is that the priests that led certain churches were assigned. In other words, those were assignments, those were positions given to them. So what we see here is that this Protestant religious revolution is creating a democratic change in the rise of those Protestant churches. Again, those congregations want a more democratic control over their religious affairs, who they choose as their pastors, and so on. And they want to also have a say in terms of the interpretation of the teachings of the Bible, and so on and so forth. Again, so in other words, they want local control of their churches, okay, in every possible way. So those were the preconditions for all of the revolutions we're going to be looking at here, particularly starting with the English Civil War. Okay, so this is the first serious upheaval, again, that opened up, you will, the age of revolutions, in which we're going to see the influence of both capitalism and Protestantism coming together to influence the thinking of certain sectors of the population that believed that certain changes were necessary in the political order, because capitalism introduced private property. Merchants, farmers pretty much agreed that that's one of the leading principles of the kind of state, the ideal state. In other words, that individual will be able to own property. And of course, Protestantism as well. In England, particularly, we're going to see that the Protestants are going to join the revolution, fight on the side of the revolution, particularly because they wanted to remove the church from the state. They did not want an official religion. They didn't want a central church to dictate, what people needed to follow, what kind of religion they needed to believe in, and so on. So they're going to be part of this democratic movement, if you will. So again, those were part of the so-called age of the democratic revolutions that start with the English Civil War. Okay, the English Civil War spanned between 1642 and 1651. This is the first political upheaval, okay, of the age of democratic revolutions, the English Civil War. It is a civil war in which the people, the sectors of the population that contested the old feudal order, composed of the monarchy, aristocracy, and church, were the merchants, farmers, and one branch of Protestantism, of course, was called the Puritans. They're going to come together and contest the old feudal order. Okay. Again, some of the issues that actually are going to bring them together in this kind of alliance, if you will, to contest the old feudal order is, of course, the issue of private property. The issue of private property under the old feudal order, feudalism, was the fact that in feudal England, as in the rest of feudal Europe, there is the absence of private property. In other words, the concept of private property simply doesn't exist. So even if you own of course, land, or you have, let's say, warehouses for distribution centers. If you're a merchant engaged in the distribution of goods, if you own ships, like a shipping company, and so on and so forth, all of that property is not private. It's, of course, you're handling that, but at any given time, the monarch can simply seize it and take it away. Okay, because all of that property is the monarch's property. Okay, so again, under feudalism, private property is not honored; it doesn't exist. So this is one of the issues that is going to bring, particularly farmers and merchants together to contest that issue. When their property was affected, of course, the issue of taxation. Again, taxation under the monarchy meant that whenever the king needed taxes to raise revenues, it will simply, again, enact a tax. It will fall heavier on the merchant class than in anybody else, because with the rise of international trade and with the rise of the merchant class is the one that has wealth. So if you're a king in England during this time, late 1500s, early 1600s, if you wanted monies very quickly, very promptly, all you need to do is just tax the merchants, okay? And they'll give you all the money. And the problem is that merchants are not represented in the state, so they don't have a voice, they don't have a vote, because of this absolutism I just explained. The king is the absolute ruler, so again, the king needs money and merchants must pay it, of course. So there's no representation, taxation without representation, that is to say. And so that led, of course, to a series of problems. When we're going to see, of course, a new king in England by the name of King Charles I, who really took very serious this concept of absolutism and divine rights of kings. He was really convinced that his right to rule was given to him by God, that he was an absolute monarch, in every sense of the word, because he was acting on God's behalf. He was the representative of God on earth. So as soon as he needed money, which he actually did, he was a series of problems, of course. Some rebellions he was facing, of course, in the northern regions of England, in the Kingdom of Scotland. He wanted to put down the rebellion, of course, send the force. So he needed quick money. Okay, he needed to raise a force very quickly. He needed resources. He looked around and he said, I'm going to tax the merchants. They seem to be doing really good. They're succeeding in this new economy, in international trade. So I'm just going to tax them, But the taxations came without representation. So, of course, the merchants, some of them refused to pay taxes. So, therefore, King Charles, of course, imprisoned some of them. Some of them actually conspired against the king. So they were sentenced to death as well. Some others, the king seized their property, the confiscation of private property. It was not private, by the way. It was simply property. And the king said, well, if you're not going to pay those taxes, I'm just going to simply seize your assets. That is to say, because, again, of this absolutism, this divine rights of king. So, again, this was very problematic because the merchants feel that they simply have absolutely no rights whatsoever. They can lose their liberty, they can be imprisoned, they can lose their life, they can be sentenced to death, and they can lose their property. So you're going to see, of course, life, liberty, and property, of course. The principles of life, liberty, and property came from here, particularly, again, from King Charles' imprisoning of the merchants, or the death penalty, and the confiscation of property. So this is one issue. Again, that is going to lead to the English Civil War, again, of 1642. And of course, King Charles I was a staunch Catholic, of course, who wanted to, in a certain sense, restore Catholicism in England. England had already gone Protestant. There was, the rise of Protestant groups, many of whom were Puritans in England. And the Catholic king, Stuart, this is, again, Charles I, he's from the Stuart dynasty. They're Catholic. They're now opposing any serious fundamental Protestant change, Protestant reform to take place. Okay, so many of the kind of changes that the Protestants want to bring about, again, the king simply don't want to change anything again of the church in England. He really wants to preserve the church, to look as much as possible to the Catholic Church. So again, he's really opposing the Protestant reforms in England. So this is another thing. Again, we got a Catholic king trying to impose that faith again on a population that, for the most part, have converted to Protestantism. Okay, so again, the population is now changing. They're going Protestant, but the ruler is still Catholic and is trying to use his authority in order to kind of enforce Catholicism and go against the Protestants. That is to say, so the king see himself as the head of the Church of England. He's trying to enforce the doctrine and kind of, preserve Catholicism in terms of the doctrine as much as possible in England. He wants to preserve the hierarchy, the church hierarchy, and also the landholdings as well of the church. And of course, he embarks on the persecution of Puritans as well. So this is a situation, again, that we see a combination of factors here in the English Civil War, with the rise of capitalism, of course, and that is, again, the idea of free enterprise. It's not even free now, but it's just a creation of commercial enterprises, etc., by the merchants. The merchants are losing their assets. They're losing their investments. They're losing their land in many cases, because the king is taxing them without representation. And we also see religious persecution. Of course, a Catholic king persecuting the Protestant population of England. And that, of course, leads to the actual problem. Again, the actual problem in England, again, that leads the merchants to seize control of Parliament. The merchants believe that this Parliament, which is a political body that crafts legislation, it was a political body that it was previously controlled by the old feudal lords, the landowners of England. Well, now the merchant class want to seize control of Parliament, and they want Parliament to be the political body that the merchants are going to use to negotiate with the king. Okay, so in other words, they want political representation. They want some form of representation or participation in the state. And they said, maybe we can actually just control Parliament, and through Parliament, we can actually negotiate with the king. We can negotiate laws or taxes, anything again. And we can actually write legislation. And this is going to protect our interest, again, the interest of the merchant class, that is to say. Okay, and so once the merchant seize control of Parliament, Parliament will be supported by a series of merchants across England, assisted by farmers and also Protestants, of course, many of them who were actually Puritans, persecuted by the king. And what they now want is change. They want to actually change the system of England, the political system. They want or demand political and religious reforms, and thereby they're declaring new political principles. They want to reform the system in a way that they want England to have a parliamentary system of government. In other words, they want Parliament to be the government of England, that is to say. And so this is a political body in which there will be, of course, the members of Parliament elected, if you will, from different sectors of England. That is to say, many of whom are going to be merchants, by the way. So the merchants really want to control now Parliament, and they want Parliament to be, of course, the supreme body of the land. And they want the monarchy to be perhaps subordinated, if you will, to Parliament, or at least equal, but they want Parliament to exercise significant authority, again, in England. They want property rights. They want also to bring about land reform, to seize some of the land holdings of the aristocracy and the church, to break it down and trying to actually sell it on the market. so people can actually buy it and own land, that is to say, like farmers and other investors as well. And religious independence. Again, they also want, again, religious independence as well in England. So again, the Great Rebellion begins rather quickly. It's the English Civil War was called the Great Rebellion. And we're going to see, of course, now a fight between the monarchy, King Charles I, and Parliament. Okay, there's going to be now a civil war because some people will be fighting on the side of the monarchy, and some other English people, subjects, will be fighting on the side of Parliament as who is going to be supreme, who is going to be dominant. Should we have a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, or should we have a parliament, a kind of representative form of government, a parliament? Again, this was a struggle between the old feudal order and again the new capitalist forces. That is to say, the old feudal order is the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church are fighting now the forces of capitalism, the new merchant class, as well with the Protestants as well. Okay, the followers of the king, for the most part, were Catholics, and also they're fighting, of course, Protestants. So the English Civil War can be understood in so many dimensions. A struggle between monarchy and parliament. Okay, should we have one strong man making decisions for everybody, or should we have a political body, an assembly, a congress, or a parliament, in which again the representatives of that political body are going to get together and craft law for everybody? In other words, again, this is a struggle of feudalism versus capitalism. Again, should we still have a monarchy and an aristocracy and church heading society? Or should we introduce, of course, a new system of capitalism that will allow people to actually own property? Okay. Should we have Catholicism as the official faith that is imposed on everybody, or should we allow people freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, religious independence, so they can be Protestants? Okay, so this is an issue, of course, that will be seen in the Texas Revolution. Okay, as we'll see, the issue of the Catholic Church, of course, trying to impose Catholicism on Mexico, and of course, the emergence of a general as the dictator of Mexico, Santa Anna, was very reminiscent of the English Civil War. Of course, when, of course, Santa Anna and the Catholic Church wanted to impose both Catholicism on Texas, in which the vast majority of the population had gone Protestants, and also wanted to reduce Texas to a simple department and make all the rules, all the laws for Texas. Santa Anna wanted to dictate, of course, what needed to be done in that state. So again, this is an issue that is going to be very much at work in the Texas Revolution, what happened in the English Civil War. Now, in the English Civil War, of course, the monarchy will lose. In 1649, King Charles was actually executed. And even though the monarchy afterwards was restored, it continued. The English monarchy continued. The following monarchs tried to still be dominant again in the political order of England, not until 1689, finally, in the so-called Glorious Revolution, after a series of turmoils and struggles between the monarchy and parliament, finally, in 1689, in the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, finally, the issue was settled. Now, finally, the monarchy was, subordinated to the parliament, and now we're going to see in England a parliamentary system form of government that introduced a new constitution, a Bill of Rights, guaranteeing individuals the right to private property, that is to say. So very important. Now, private property has become part, again, of the constitution, again, of England. Okay, so this is very important. Now let us look at, again, another process here rather quickly, and that is the process of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment ideas are also going to play a fundamental role in shaping, of course, the other revolutions we're going to be discussing here. The Enlightenment was a philosophical and scientific revolution. This is part of the age of revolutions, okay, that we have been discussing. So we discussed the rise of capitalism was a kind of an economic revolution, the rise of Protestantism, again, a religious revolution. The English Civil War was a political revolution, very much influenced by capitalism and Protestantism. But as we move into the early 1700s, there's going to be an intellectual, philosophical, scientific revolution that will be known as the Enlightenment. Again, in this phenomenon, again, in this intellectual revolution, so to speak, we're going to see the introduction of a new science. Okay, a new science that was based more on the understanding that in order to find how nature works, we need to simply study physical objects. We need to understand the world of matter, in other words. So instead of taking into account spiritual principles or spiritual forces like spirits or ghosts or angels, etc., that were, making things happen in this world, the way people understood that in the past, what the scientific revolution actually said is that no, in reality, there is a creator, but the creator is so far removed from creation that creation is just functioning on its own in a very mechanical way. So what humans can actually do, and the only thing that we can do, said those scientists, is simply try to understand how this machine works and try to study the parts of this machine, the physical components, the material elements, the material forces, if you will, to discover natural laws. That is to say, because the new science said this is a materialist universe, this is a materialist reality, and this is the only thing that we can actually study and know. It's a very materialist approach to knowing, how the world works in a very materialistic way. So in the scientific revolution, of course, what is going to happen is that this new science began to question everything related or based on religious claims. So everything that was based on a religious claim, like, for example, the church, that the church was established by God on earth, that the church was the representative of God on earth, etc., or the monarchs, that the kings were ruling on behalf of God because their right to rule was given to them by God, and so on. So all of the institutions that were based on religious ideas or religious claims were questioned. And this is, again, what the scientific revolution is going to do, is begin to question the divine rights of kings, of course, that maybe the rights of kings do not derive from God, but maybe they should derive from the subjects, from the people that the king governs, or the queen governs, for that matter. Okay? So again, this scientific revolution altered the way people thought about politics, because instead of just accepting their institutions as valid, as well, of course, we have a church, we have a monarchy because they're divine institutions, they're divinely ordained. Particularly the intellectuals, the European intellectuals, are going to depart from that claim, and they're going to actually devote significant amount of time to formulate new political ideas. That is to say, that they really began to think that maybe what we need to do is try to think about what will be the ideal state. What kind of government, what kind of state will be the ideal in terms of the people that lived under that state to be truly happy. That is to say, to find true happiness. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of writings, essays, and so on, treaties books that were written all over Europe during the Enlightenment thinkers that were called the Enlightenment philosophers, political philosophers. There's a lot of political ideas, political philosophies written between 1680 and 1790 in Europe. And of course, they're going to start formulating, of course, ideas in which they're going to now introduce the notion that that the divine rights of kings might not be an accurate claim. That is to say, that indeed the rights or rules of the king do not really derive from the divine, but rather derive from the population, from the people. And again, this led to the notion that human beings indeed are born with certain rights, that human beings have rights. And again, that was, a notion that was simply known as natural rights, the natural rights philosophy, as it was called, natural rights. That is to say, that human beings also have rights, and they're given by God, okay, or by nature in this case, not necessarily by God, but they were actually born with those rights by nature, that by nature we're simply, as human beings, are endowed with certain rights. The idea that people are also in charge of their political destinies, that people can indeed form the ideal state according to how they dream about it, they imagine it according to how they believe it will be ideal. It's called popular sovereignty. That, again, people have the right to form, of course, their own political structures or political institutions. It's called popular sovereignty. Today, simply called democracy, by the way. Okay, today, the idea of popular sovereignty. And also, again, that the ideal state will be one in which people will be given religious freedom, religious independence, and there will be total separation of church and state, so people can pursue their own dictates. They can actually, formulate whatever belief they want. They can worship whatever they want, and again, try to fulfill their spiritual needs according to, their own conscience. So it was essential, therefore, to separate church and state. So those were very important ideas that were formulated by the Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, for example. John Locke was the English philosopher who formulated the natural rights philosophy of life, liberty, and property. That human beings actually are born with certain rights that are given by nature. That is to say, this is natural rights. That is to say, those are, again, principles that John Locke actually elaborated or formulated from the experience of the English Civil War, when the merchants were deprived of their life, liberty, and property, when King Charles I was imprisoning them or sentencing them to death or simply confiscating their property. So again, what John Locke is saying is that, again, the ideal state will be one in which those particular rights are actually honored and protected. Again, that would be the ideal, according to John Locke, and one of the most sacred of those of the rights that John Locke is going to spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about is the right to private property, because he was a merchant himself. He was actually an investor. He had investments in trading operations overseas, etc. So he was a merchant. So therefore, he's really thinking that we need to actually create the ideal state in which private property will be central to one of the principles of the state, because he said, indeed, this is how actually monarchies got started in the distant past. John Locke believed that the first monarchs in European history were created by property owners for the whole purpose of protecting property. In other words, when there were no kings, okay, absolutely no kings, certain property owners, landowners got together and says, well, we maybe need somebody to protect our property. Okay, we're going to elect one of us to become the king, and the whole responsibility of the king is to protect our property. That is to say, so this is what he's writing about, because he sees the necessity of crafting, of course, the ideal state in this fashion in which private property will be central to the activities of the state. And of course, this is very important for creating a state in which we're going to see the rise of capitalism, of course, because without private property, capitalism cannot take place. Okay, so what John Locke is actually saying is, we need a state that can actually honor private property, so the merchant class, can actually flourish, can actually succeed. Because if private property is not protected, the merchant class is not going to actually be allowed to grow. Freedom of conscience, of course, separation of church and state is another, of course, issue that he's very concerned about. That is so necessary for the ideal state. It's another Enlightenment idea, by the way. And the other thinker I just want to mention is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was famous for writing a treatise, a political philosophy titled The Social Contract, in which he's really also outlining, dreaming about, imagining the ideal state as well. What will be the ideal political community? And in his understanding, again, the ideal political community is one in which the people are going to have a say in the political process, in the political system. That the ideal state is one in which people agree to, that this is the contract, the covenant, is that for people to be truly happy, okay, the population, they must build a state that they actually agree to, consent, that is to say. So what that entails, of course, is that you need to create a political system of representation, a system of political representation, an assembly, a parliament, or a congress from which people will be chosen or elected, again, to serve as representatives, that is to say. Members of the communities, members of the towns, members of the different cities and ports are going to be drawn upon, elected to serve, of course, under an assembly or a parliament or a congress to represent the interest of the communities from which they come. Okay, and of course that entails, of course, a process of elections, if you will, that again, the consent of the governed is also, again, the practice or process by which people vote or elect, their leaders and rulers, a system of elections, that is to say. So according to Rousseau, the social contract, again, this is the ideal state, the consent of the governed. People consent to the state, they agree. This is the covenant, this is the pact in which the ideal state is one in which people actually, of course, are represented in the state, and people are actually choosing through a system of elections their representatives, of course. So this is totally new, by the way, in human history, because up to this point, there's no popular elections anywhere. The Enlightenment is going to introduce the very first notion of popular elections, representative form of government, in other words, that this is how human societies should live on Earth. So we're now nearing, of course, the end of our first session. They're still pending to discuss the American Revolution and the French Revolution. We're not going to spend more than 10 minutes on each on session 2. We do have to, by the way, just get through the essentials of the American Revolution. This is not going to be an extensive discussion of all of the causes, etc. So what's significant only here is how this is going to influence the Texas Revolution, that is to say. So I'm only just focusing, again, on the main ideas, ideals, principles, and goals of the revolution that we have discussed so far that are going to play a key role in the Texas Revolution, that the revolutionaries in Texas were mostly inspired by, for example. So far, up to this point, we have, of course, discussed, for example, the rise of capitalism and private property. Okay, very important. How in the Texas Revolution, we're also going to see, of course, the formation of enterprises and, land grants, contracts, for example. We're going to be paying attention to that rather closely in session 2, looking at the origins, how people were given contracts to, bring people, settlers or colonists. There were enterprises, there were plantations, there were cattle ranches, land development, real estate, and so on taking place. So we see the rise of a merchant class, property owners, and of course, the rise of capitalism in Texas prior to 1836, particularly in the 1820s, all the way to 1835, we're going to see the rise of capitalism, so to speak, in Texas, and the rise of a merchant class, in which just at the time of the revolution, the new Mexican state actually declared void and null many of the contracts that it had given, of course. And this is going to affect, by the way, the merchant class, the property owners, the real estate developers, and so on of Texas. So again, capitalism is going to play a key role in the Texas Revolution because it affected private property. And we've seen how the rise of capitalism in England, for example, led to the English Civil War. The English Civil War we just discussed a moment ago. The merchants, particularly, that was mostly affected by the laws, the taxation without representation of King Charles I, led to that upheaval. Again, Protestantism as well. Again, the rise of Protestantism and how Protestants wanted to limit the power of the church in trying to impose the religion, trying to impose the doctrine, trying to also appoint the religious officials to every church, how Protestants wanted actually democratic control, again, of their own churches. This is also going to play a key role, by the way, in the Texas Revolution, as we'll see, when, of course, most of the newcomers, the colonists in Texas that came into Texas in the 1820s and early 1830s were Protestants, okay? And still, Mexico had Catholicism as the official religion of the land, and that it was trying, the Catholic Church, to trying to impose that faith, of course, on the population. That would be yet another factor, that brought about the Texas Revolution. Okay, and of course, the ideas of the Enlightenment, we just discussed, the ideas of, for example, natural rights, formulated by John Locke, life, liberty, and property. They're going to be central, of course, for the Texas Revolution because those ideas serve as a basis for the American Revolution, by the way, the independence revolution of the 13 British colonies in 1776 and the formation of the United States. And many of the newcomers, the colonists that came into Texas in the 1820s, early 1830s were Americans that were bringing with them the ideas of John Locke. They were bringing with them the ideas of the American independence revolution and the American Constitution with them. Their political culture, that is to say, they introduced it into Texas. And that also served as a great influence in the revolution itself of Texas in 1836. The consent of the governed, system of representation, people having a say in the system, taking a vote, electing their leaders. Again, all of that will be, of course, issues that will be, of course, contested in 1835, 1836, when Mexico was now moving into a centralized system of government vested in the power of a single person, a single general, that wanted to dictate policy for everybody, in other words. So there's going to be, of course, a struggle there. So this is all we got, again, for the first session. When we come back in session 2, we're just going to actually look rather quickly to the American and French Revolution rather quickly, and then move into the origins and causes of the Texas Revolution in session 2. Okay, so this is the end of session 1 of the Texas Revolution, and we'll see then in session 2 for the next segment. Thank you.